How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.
Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Monday, July the 27th. Andy Burnham will meet Volodymyr Zelenskyy today at a naval base and hand over the rights to a UK-developed signal jammers system. That will be his first international visitor since becoming Prime Minister. The Prime Minister bearing gifts to show continuing support for Kyiv. And the government wants to ensure the focus remains on Ukraine amid many other geopolitical distractions. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. And that takes us straight to the big dilemma for Andy Burnham. He's pledged to stand up to Donald Trump if he needs to. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. And it's a kind of tonal reset towards the US president. But Britain needs the US for so much, including playing a big role ensuring ongoing US support for Ukraine with a Trump administration that, as we've seen over the last few months, does waver quite regularly. So will there really be that much of a shift? And if there was, actually, does that hurt rather than help relations with Ukraine and Ukraine's fight against Russia?
Week 2 of the Burnham premiership, that second album, Feeling for a New Leader, and the announcement blitz continues. Along with that meeting today with Zelenskyy, we are expecting move on social care and a speech on devolution at the end of the week, coinciding with the result of the Manchester Metro Mayor announcement to elect a replacement for the man, now the Prime Minister. And 2 polls have put his Labour candidate, Bev Craig, in pole position. We get the result on Friday afternoon.
To get a sense of how this week's going to feel, I think it's vibe-wise and tonally, I think we learnt a lot last week. I can't quite believe that Andy Burnham became Prime Minister just a week ago. But when he did, he promised the biggest change for 40 years. The biggest change for 40 years. So reaching absolutely for the skies. Bigger than Brexit, bigger than the financial crash. But what we learned through last week, that the early announcements that he made were actually incredibly cautious and incremental and frankly quite cheap. So week 1 was the rhetoric is big, turned up to the max, but actually much more small beer when it comes to the sort of amount spent and the change delivered. And this is the pattern I think we'll take into this week. So if it was Keir Starmer doing the announcement that you got this week, we would talk about re-announcing and further consultations across a whole range of subjects. So income tax devolution to mayors, that was actually something Rachel Reeves was already consulting on. Social care and speeding up the Louise Casey review, well, that's more of the same, but just perhaps a bit quicker. And the tough language around welfare, well, that's just waiting for the Alan Milburn report, which we don't have yet, but whose policy prescriptions around cutting benefits are for the young, because there's no conditionality around things like personal independence payments. Well, that is well trailed. But the thing about Burnham, and I think the skill about Burnham, and we see this deployed all over the place, and we'll see it this week, is he just puts the politics in and injects it a little bit like Botox, where it otherwise was missing. So cross-party talks, setting up dividing lines, talking about the big problems of Britain, vibes on steroids, but less detail than it first appears. Somehow when you stand back, actually, an Andy Burnham intervention can feel really powerful, but when you sift out the detail of what's actually new, there's just slightly less in it.
His line between politics and policy, Sam, in the interview with Laura Kuenssberg at the BBC, leading on social care, ranging over a whole lot of issues. What he does do in that interview is he makes the case for reform of the state and the way the state is working or not working in a much more dramatic and urgent way than Keir Starmer ever managed to do. He says very kind of fronted, like he's a columnist or something, the NHS will collapse under the weight of trying to care for people who really not needed to end up in the NHS system. And he says, when he's asked what he wants to do about it, he says, well, I can't put a timeline on it right here, right now. But he says he will use whatever political capital I have, he will put into fixing broken social care. It is short on specifics. One thing I think, if you look between the lines, what he's also doing is, I think he's plugging in the people that he wants to deliver on these priorities. So one person I think is definitely going to be back in that mix, driving government and social policy and social change in many ways, is Louise Casey. Her review into social care got a very strong endorsement from the Prime Minister. Social care was on a longer path. He says, I'm bringing it forward. Remember that she's also the person who has done the policy work that underpins the rough sleepers push and getting on top of that problem in the cities. What was the first thing Andy Burnham foregrounded as a priority, partly to please the social conscience of his party, but also because there you've got someone who's worked on it before and has a plan that can be put into action. Well, this morning, Kemi Badenoch had her first pop back on all of this, saying the additional funding for social care had to come from cuts, not from higher taxes. And I think the reason she's doing that, Sam, is that Burnham has backed higher taxes in the past. And so she's punching a bit of a bruise there to find out how far she can push her opponent on that. What else he got?
So I do think that's absolutely fascinating. What's going on here is you're seeing the landscape, but the landscape is the same. And you don't know, for instance, at the moment in England, people with savings worth more than £23,250 do not get help with their care costs. You get absolutely no sense from the interview about whether that will rise. We read in the papers that the cost of daily care, food and accommodation, won't be something that's that people get helped with. So there is still a sort of cliff edge for people financially if that's the route that they go down. And there is a choice about ultimately where you draw the line on assets, and therefore how wealthy are the people that you're going to help. And that is an intensely political question, which is why a Labour solution is always likely to be quite different to a Tory solution, which is why a cross-party deal always feels to me quite hard. I know that Andy Burnham's placed so much over the years on a cross-party solution to this, right back to 2009, and his talks with Andrew Lansley. But the political incentives for a Tory settlement on this are just drawn at a different places as Labour, which would want to help their voters, and so that's where it gets stuck. Can Louise Casey come up with a plan that is just a Labour-focused one, or one that works more widely? That's why I think there is a long way to go on this. What else are you hearing about this week?
Playbook has a look ahead to announcements on getting young people into employment or training, and talking about a Tuesday announcement, which is heavily trailing some sort of assault on sickness benefits and the rise in those going to young people. The colleagues there being told that what's being announced on Tuesday is the carrot end of the plan. There was a bit of coverage of the more stick end of it to try to manage down those numbers of claimants over the weekend. Pat McFadden has been to Rotterdam, staying in post there, in charge of welfare reform for Andy Burnham. He's been looking at how the Dutch deploy NEETs on projects like litter clearing. I suppose they're not NEETs by the time they're cleaning up the litter and doing other socially useful tasks. But the point being that the Dutch have found a mix which does pay people, gets them out of the house, can support any mental health conditions, obviously apart from the most clinically serious ones. And I'm pretty sure that the aim of that is to say, look, this is the Dutch here. This is not some dreadful draconian system. This is actually good for supporting improvement in mental health. It gets people out and about, keeps them visible, engaged in society, and it does something useful. Maybe that is a model for the UK.
I think you're right, Anne. I think you're right. But
you don't sound very convinced by that.
But here we go, because I'm going to sort of refer you back to the Laura Kuenssberg interview on exactly this topic. And as somebody who's recently did a deep dive on welfare, you're left quite frustrated. So the question is, as you absolutely identify, is removing some entitlements from younger people to get them into work by getting them to do other things, what he's going to do. And he's pushed on this in the interview. And he says there is some sort of rhetoric about the need for change. He says we need to get serious about getting the welfare bill down. Okay, tick. And he gives a vague line. It's about changing some of the support. But when you look at his history, it's always been about increasing in-work support to get people back into jobs rather than cutting things. And he does hark back to his previous language about not wanting to blame people, i.e. not wanting to put in the foreground too much, taking benefits away. The thing we don't want to go to is a crude approach on benefits, he says. So even now, as all the other ministers, and I think Pat McFadden you mentioned, I think Louise Haigh as well, would want, definitely Alan Milburn would want a tougher approach when it comes to benefits. But I wonder whether benefit reform is wanted by the whole of the rest of the team, but he hasn't quite steeled himself to go there like that. And it's a bit the same with immigration. He's got Shabana Mahmood back in the Home Office. And he just says, what about this business of extending indefinite leave to remain and to make that take 10 years rather than 5, which is her big proposal. He sort of says, I'll look at the balance of the arguments. Again, you're just not quite sure. Just domestic policy on Vise, but not specifics, whether it's a long interview or a short one.
It's a good point, because remember that so many people around him were involved in that revolt on welfare reform last year, and particularly on what they saw as a crude and in some cases even cruel application of a more sweeping reform or removal of PIP, or at least making it harder to qualify for. My guess is that by having someone like Pat McFadden, who is hugely respected, has done a lot of work on this and has said, has told a lot of people privately in the transition from Starmer to Burnham that he's not giving up. The reason he wants to stay in that post is he does believe something has to be delivered on reform of the benefit system. But using examples like that Dutch one, you can say that you're offering opportunity, something a bit shiny in policy terms, as well as just saying, well, we're going to take away your PIP if you don't take it. But you're right, unless at some point you have the stick to follow on from the carrot, and you can't wield that unless the Prime Minister is fully behind it. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. So you've got the system now beginning to push in a more stringent direction, but it will not be able to do so unless it has perhaps the more full-throated support of Andy Burnham. I thought we should maybe also turn to foreign affairs in our time, Sam, because we did start the podcast by talking about that meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, which has become a semi-constitutional rite of passage for a leader, that you show your support for the embattled but still battling on Ukrainian leader. There was just a good question from Laura Kunsberg about would he take a call from Vladimir Putin? Well, I think we kind of knew that in Keir Starmer's case, he aligned very much his talking points with Kyiv and just said there's nothing to talk about right now, so probably not. Now, Andy Burnham did say something a bit more nuanced. He said, I'd have to know the circumstances. Well, yeah, I mean, usually Vladimir Putin's not calling up to say, do you know what, this whole Ukraine thing was a mistake. Can we get back to having a better relationship? So I thought that was a bit of a dodge. On Donald Trump, he says that Keir Starmer was right to call for caution on Iran, but he was pushed on whether it was a mistake. And again, went into that slightly hovering language. There's a big concern about the conflict, the escalating nature that has been communicated. Passive tense. I did have a concern at the time. Maybe this slightly fits your analysis of Burnham's speak when pushed on specifics, which is how keen are you or not to support the Americans in the Iran crisis to try to bring it to an end, or do you still have major doubts?
Let's take one specific. Just before the transition of power, Keir Starmer authorised the ongoing use of UK bases, Diego Garcia and the like, for Iranian bombing campaigned by the US. And so that was the policy position that Andy Burnham inherited. But conscious of the change of tone of the new prime minister, I think Whitehall's trying to get a handle on whether that was definitely the ongoing stance of this government. And I think some feelers were put out by the Foreign Office to Number 10 to say, okay, so that was the position of the last guy that you've inherited. Are you still happy with that? And the answer came back from Number 10 that Andy Burnham sort of knew and had noted the position left behind by Keir Starmer. He didn't love it, but for now, that's what it was, or kind of a clarification to that extent. And I think therein lies the sort of policy dilemma for Whitehall when dealing with Andy Burnham. They get steers that the new Prime Minister is not massively keen on a stance, but there isn't a change of actual position. Can they expect a change of position further down the track? Can they not? They don't quite know. So I think that there's a little bit of uncertainty. So there's a sense things could change in Whitehall. But when, again, you look at some of the ways in which Andy Burnham talks about Donald Trump, talking about his warm exchange, talking about, you're just going to have to call things as they develop because you're in a changing world and you've got to do what's best for the country. It's far from clear that it's going to be the dramatic break that you might have thought listening to some of the earlier words about the special relationship.
I think that's right. And he does say that he reserves the right to voice a different opinion to Trump. But actually, when you unpack that's true. He does have that right. The question is, what are the risks and rewards of making use of it? I mean, another version that I've heard a bit more from defence security circles on this is while everybody settles into their posts, said Miliband as Foreign Secretary, Wes Streeting in defence, that the Gulf crisis is moving very quickly. It could easily take off again at pace. I think you flagged this last week, Sam, at any moment, but probably he would rather hold the line of we do what we do before, and I have some reservations about it, because that way he doesn't actually have to make very material decisions. He may just hope that the whole thing kind of moves along to some form of messy resolution, or at least hasn't gone to the next stage of wild escalation, and he doesn't have to do much about it. I mean, that wouldn't, I'm not saying that entirely cynically, that may not be the worst thing if you're a new prime minister and you've got a very reactive US president and you've got a lot of interests and economic interests, including any cost of living help that you're trying to give will be massively offset if things continue to go wrong in the Straits of Hormuz. One thing I was just looking at over the weekend was how you stand up for the national interest with a prime minister, with a president, like Donald Trump, because that is an area where you do feel that Andy Burnham wants a different tone. I do catch that as well. He wants to say Keir Starmer probably did the best that he could to get the best out of Donald Trump that he could. But it's a very blurring line when you look at everything from our defence reliance on the US. I do notice that's a bit played down at the moment rhetorically, but just if you look at those, our big needs, it's something, if we can't get a hold of Patriot missiles, we need something very much like it. So much of the capacity for the real frontline defence of the UK against the Russia threat still entangles us with America. If you look at F-35s, not only made by Lockheed in Texas, but with key parts from Israel, just to make things more complex for Wes Streeting, the defense secretary, who's been quite outspoken actually on Israel and Gaza. So I think you do find yourself still very much interwoven in an intricate relationship with the US in foreign and security policy. Whether or not you reserve the right to speak more freely about it, those are the cards that you've been dealt.
That's right. I mean, everybody kind of wants a Love Actually moment in the Labour Party sometimes, it feels like. But what you forget is the Love Actually moment where Hugh Grant stands up to the Prime Minister happens right at the end of the film, and then the credits roll, and you don't see security and defence cooperation then being downgraded. You don't see the withdrawal of, UK's demand that the US help, the Ukrainians a little bit more. You don't see the fact that we don't get carves out on tariffs. Part 2 of Love Actually might actually be a lot more grim than the film upon which some people's foreign policy strategy is based.
He does get to marry the very charming tea lady, though, so there is that. But I take your point. I love the idea of the policy sequel to Love Actually. Sometimes
Only
there
on
you
this
go.
podcast.
There's your next project. Hollywood is waiting for you.
That's our 20 minutes up. I'm off to a naval base to see Andy Burnham. So we'll have more on that tomorrow. And we'll be back then for this special extra week of Politics at Sam and Anne's. Thanks, Andy. We're delighted to be here for you and for our listeners.
Well, send us a dispatch from the base.
How does a banana trigger a CIA-backed coup? Do AirPods herald the arrival of a new global order? What do LED lights say about the future of humanity? I'm Ed Conway, and in each episode of my new podcast, Stuff Matters, I take an object, crack it open, and reveal the world-shaping forces hidden inside. This is economics told through the things we think we understand. Search Stuff Matters on your podcast app to listen and follow.